So, in chapter 7 of Charlotte's Web, Wilbur learned that he might be killed to be eaten by the farmers, and Charlotte promised that she was going to save him. So, let's see what happens now in chapter 8. A talk at home. On Sunday morning, Mr. and Mrs. Arable and Fern were sitting at breakfast in the kitchen. Avery had finished and was upstairs looking for his slingshot. "Did you know that Uncle Homer's goslings hatched?" asked Fern. "How many?" said Mr. Arable. "7," replied Fern. "There were 8 eggs, but 1 egg didn't hatch, and the old goose told Templeton that she didn't want it anymore, and he took it away." "The old goose did what?" asked Mrs. Arable, gazing at her daughter with a queer, worried look. "Told Templeton that she didn't want the egg anymore," repeated Fern. "And who is Templeton?" said Mrs. Arable. "He's the rat," replied Fern. "None of us like him very much." "Who's us?" asked Mr. Arable. "Oh, everybody in the barn cellar. Wilbur and the sheep and the lambs and the goose and the gander and the goslings and Charlotte and me." "Charlotte?" said Mrs. Arable. "Who's Charlotte?" "She's Wilbur's best friend. She's terribly clever." "And what does she look like?" said Mrs. Arable. "Well," said Fern thoughtfully, "she has 8 legs. All spiders do, I guess." "Charlotte is a spider?" asked Fern's mother. Fern nodded. "A big gray one. She has a web across the top of Wilbur's doorway. She catches flies and sucks their blood. Wilbur adores her." "Does he really?" said Mrs. Arable rather vaguely. She was staring at Fern with a worried expression on her face. "Oh yes, Wilbur adores Charlotte," said Fern. "Do you know what Charlotte said when the goslings hatched?" "I haven't the faintest idea," said Mrs. Arable. "Tell us." "Well, when the first gosling stuck its little head out from under the goose, I was sitting on my stool in the corner, and Charlotte was on her web. She made a speech. She said, 'I am sure that every one of us here in the barn cellar will be gratified to learn that after 4 weeks of unremitting effort and patience on the part of the goose, she has now something to show for it.' Don't you think that was a pleasant thing for her to say?" "Yes, I do," said Mrs. Arable. "And now, Fern, it's time for you to get ready for Sunday school, and tell Avery to get ready. And this afternoon, you can tell me more about what goes on in Uncle Homer's barn. Aren't you spending quite a lot of time there? You go there almost every afternoon, don't you?" "I like it there," replied Fern. She wiped her mouth and ran upstairs. After she had left the room, Mrs. Arable spoke in a low voice to her husband. "I worry about Fern," she said. "Did you hear the way she was rambling about those animals, pretending like they talked?" Mr. Arable chuckled. "Maybe they do talk," he said. "I've sometimes wondered. At any rate, don't worry about Fern. She's got a lively imagination. Kids just hear all sorts of things." "Just the same, I do worry about her," replied Mrs. Arable. "I think I shall ask Dr. Dorian about it next time I see him. He loves Fern almost as much as we do. I want him to know how queerly she is acting about the pig and everything. I don't think it's normal. You know perfectly well animals don't talk." Mr. Arable grinned. "Maybe our ears aren't as sharp as Fern's," he said. So this is our first indication that Fern can actually hear the animals. I was under the impression that only the animals could hear each other, but it turns out that Fern knows what they're saying too. Let's see what happens next. This is chapter 9, Wilbur's Boast. A spider's web is stronger than it looks. Although it's made of thin, delicate strands, the web is not easily broken. However, a web gets torn down every day by the insects that kick around in it, and a spider must rebuild it when it gets full of holes. Charlotte liked to do her weaving in the late afternoon, and Fern liked to sit nearby and watch. One afternoon, she heard a most interesting conversation and witnessed a strange event. "You have awfully long hair, Charlotte," said Wilbur, as the spider busily worked on her task. "My legs are hairy for a good reason," replied Charlotte. "Furthermore, each leg of mine has 7 sections: the coxa, the trochanter, the femur, the patella, the tibia, the metatarsus, and the tarsus." Wilbur sat upright. "You're kidding," he said. "No, I'm not." "Say those names again. I didn't catch the first time." "Coxa, trochanter, femur, patella, tibia, metatarsus, and tarsus." "Goodness," said Wilbur, looking down at his own chubby legs. "I don't think my legs have 7 sections." "Well," said Charlotte, "you and I lead different lives. You don't have to spin a web. It takes real leg work." "I could spin a web if I tried," said Wilbur, boasting. "I've just never tried." "Let's see you do it," said Charlotte. Fern chuckled softly, and her eyes grew wide with love for the pig. "Okay," said Wilbur. "You coach me and I'll spin one. It must be a lot of fun to spin a web. How do I start?" "Take a deep breath," said Charlotte, smiling. Wilbur breathed deeply. "Now climb up to the highest place you can get to, like this." Charlotte raced up to the top of the doorway. Wilbur scrambled to the top of the manure pile. Very good, said Charlotte. Now make an attachment with your spinators. Hurl yourself into space and let the drag line as you go down. Wilbur hesitated for a moment, then jumped into the air. He glanced hastily behind him to see if a piece of rope was following him or to check his fall, but nothing seemed to be happening in his rear, and the next thing he knew, he landed with a thump. Oomph, he grunted. Charlotte laughed so hard the web began to sway. What did I do wrong? Said the pig when he recovered from his bump. Nothing, said Charlotte. It was a nice try. I think I'll try again, said Wilbur cheerfully. I believe that what I need is a piece of string to hold me. The pig walked out into the yard. You there, Templeton? He called. The rat poked his head out from under the trough. Got a piece of string I could borrow? Asked Wilbur. I need to spin a web. Yes, indeed, said Templeton, who saved string. No trouble at all. Anything to oblige. He crept down into his hole, pushed the goose egg out of the way, and returned with an old piece of dirty white string. Wilbur examined it. That's just the thing, he said. Tie one down to my tail, will you, Templeton? Wilbur crouched low, with his thin, curly tail towards the rat. Templeton seized the string, passed it around the end of the pig's tail, and tied 2 half hitches. Charlotte watched in delight. Like Fern, he was truly fond of Wilbur, whose smelly pen and stale food attracted the flies when she needed it, and she was proud to see that he was not a quitter and was willing to try again to spin a web. While the rat and the spider and the little girl watched, Wilbur climbed again to the top of the manure pile, full of energy and hope. Everybody watched, he cried. Summoning in all his strength, he threw himself into the air head first. The string tailed behind him, but he had neglected to fasten the other end to anything, so it didn't really do any good, and Wilbur landed with a thud, crashed, and hurt. Tears came to his eyes. Templeton grinned. Charlotte sat quietly. After a bit, she spoke. You can't spin a web, Wilbur, and I advise you to put the idea out of your head. You lack 2 things that you need for spinning a web. What are they? Said Wilbur sadly. You lack a set of spinnerets, and you lack the know-how. But cheer up, you don't need to spin a web. Zuckerman supplies you with 3 big meals a day. Why should you worry about trapping food? Wilbur sighed. You're ever so much cleverer and brighter than I am, Charlotte. I guess what I'm trying to do is show off. Saves me, right? Templeton untied the string and took it back to his home. Charlotte returned to her weaving. You don't need to feel badly, Wilbur, she said. Not many creatures can spin webs. Even men aren't good as spiders, although they think they're pretty good and they will try everything. Have you ever heard of the Queensborough Bridge? Wilbur shook his head. Is it a web? Sort of, replied Charlotte. But do you know how long it took the men to build it? 8 whole years. My goodness, I would have starved to death waiting that long. I can make a web in a single evening. What do people catch in the Queensborough Bridge? Bugs? Said Wilbur. No, said Charlotte. They don't catch anything. They just keep trotting back and forth across the bridge, thinking that something better is on the other side. If they'd hang their head down at the top of the thing and wait quietly, maybe something good will come along. But no, with men, it's rush, rush, rush every minute. I'm glad that I'm a sedentary spider. What does sedentary mean? Said Wilbur. It means I sit still a good part of my time and I don't go wandering all over creation. I know a good thing when I see it, and my web is a good thing. I stay put and I wait for what comes. Gives me a chance to think. Well, I'm sort of sedentary myself, I guess, said the pig. I have to hang around here whether I want to or not. You know where I'd really like to go this evening? Where? In a forest, looking for beech nuts and truffles and delectable roots, pushing leaves aside with my wonderful strong nose, searching and sniffing the ground, smelling, smelling, smelling. You can smell just the way you are, remarked the lamb who had just walked in. I can smell you from here. You're the smelliest creature in the place. Wilbur hung his head. His eyes grew wet with tears. Charlotte noticed his embarrassment and spoke sharply to the lamb. Let Wilbur alone, she said. He has perfect right to smell, considering his surroundings. You're no bundle of sweet peas yourself. Furthermore, you are interrupting a very pleasant conversation. What were we talking about, Wilbur, when we were so rudely interrupted? Oh, I don't remember, said Wilbur. It doesn't make a difference. Let's not talk any more for a while, Charlotte. I'm getting sleepy. You go ahead and finish fixing your web, and I'll lie here and watch you. It's such a lovely evening. Wilbur stretched out his side. Twilight settled over Zuckerman's barn, and a feeling of peace. Fern knew it was almost supper time, but she couldn't bear to leave. Swallows passed on silent wings in and out of the doorways, bringing food to their young ones. From across the road, a bird sang, whippoorwill, whippoorwill. Lurvy sat down on the underside of the apple tree and lit his pipe. The animal sniffed the familiar smell of the strong tobacco. Wilbur heard a trill of the tree toad and the occasional slamming of a kitchen door. All of these sounds made him comfortable and happy, for he loved his life and he loved being part of the world on a summer evening. But as he lay there and remembered what the old sheep had told him, the thought of death coming to him, and he began to tremble with fear. "Charlotte," he said softly. "Yes, Wilbur. I don't want to die." "Of course you don't," said Charlotte in a comforting voice. "I just love it here in the barn," said Wilbur. "I love everything about this place." "Of course you do," said Charlotte. "We all do." The goose appeared, followed by her 7 goslings. They thrust their little necks out and kept a musical whistle, like a tiny troop of pipers. Wilbur listened to the sound, and he loved it in his heart. "Charlotte," he said. "Yes," said the spider. "Were you serious when you promised you would keep them from killing me?" "I've never been more serious about something in my life. I am not going to let you die, Wilbur." "How are you going to save me?" asked Wilbur, with curiosity was very strong at this point. "Well," said Charlotte vaguely, "I don't really know, but I'm working on a plan." "That's wonderful," said Wilbur. "How is the plan coming, Charlotte? Have you got very far with it? Is it coming along well?" Wilbur was trembling again, but Charlotte was cool and collected. "Oh, it's coming along all right," she said lightly. "The plan is still in its early stages and hasn't completely shaped up yet, but I'm working on it." "When do you work on it?" begged Wilbur. "When I'm hanging head down at the top of my web. That's when I do my thinking, because all of my blood is in my head." "I'll be only too glad to help in any way I can." "Oh, I work better alone," said Charlotte. "I can think better if I think alone." "All right," said Wilbur. "But don't fail to let me know if there's anything I can do to help, no matter how slight." "Well," replied Charlotte, "you must try to build yourself up. I want you to get plenty of sleep and stop worrying. Never hurry and never worry. Chew your food thoughtfully and eat every bite of it, except you must leave just enough for Templeton. Gain weight and stay well. That's the way you can help. Keep fit and don't lose your nerve. Do you understand?" "Yes, I understand," said Wilbur. "Go to bed then," said Charlotte. "Sleep is important." Wilbur trotted over to the darkest corner of his pen and threw himself down. He closed his eyes. In another minute he spoke. "Charlotte," he said. "Yes, Wilbur." "May I go to my trough and see if I had any supper left?" "I think I left a tiny bit of mashed potato." "Very well," said Charlotte, "but I want you in bed again without delay." Wilbur started to race out into the yard. "Slowly, slowly," said Charlotte. "Never hurry and never worry." Wilbur checked himself and crept slowly to his trough. He found a bit of potato, chewed it carefully, swallowed it, and went back to bed. He closed his eyes and was silent for a while. "Charlotte," he said in a whisper. "Yes." "May I get a drink of milk? I think there are a few drops left in my trough." "No, the trough is dry, and I want you to sleep. No more talking. Close your eyes and go to sleep." Wilbur shut his eyes. Fern got up from her stool and started home. Her mind was full of everything she had seen and heard. "Good night, Charlotte," said Wilbur. "Good night, Wilbur." There was a pause. "Good night, Charlotte." "Good night, Wilbur." "Good night." "Good night." Okay, and tomorrow we will read Chapter 10 called An Explosion. Bye.